about it in the previous session, right? So you don't need to register a different Azure Active Directory tenant. As in when you register a Microsoft 365 tenant, an instance of Azure Active Directory will be created in the backend that will provide you the option of managing your identities. It will act as your authentication and authorization solution. Yeah. So Microsoft 365 includes two different identity model. The first one is cloud only identity, where the source authority of these identities would be your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. That means all of the management, all of the authentication, all of the authorization will be taken care by Azure Active Directory. Yeah. Then you have the hybrid identity. In this, the user account exists in your organization's on-premise Active Directory domain services, and a copy of this is also maintained in your Azure Active Directory tenant. Yeah. So some of the administrative or management of this, some of the administrative or you can say management of these identities will be performed through your on-premise Active Directory services, and some of these would be performed by your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. Now, if your organization wants to implement a hybrid model, you can select from two directory synchronization tools to keep the on-premise and cloud identities in sync. Yeah. The traditional tool that we have been using for quite some time is referred to as Azure AD Connect. Before this was also referred to as DIRSync. Yeah. Now, Azure AD Connect is an on-premise solution. It checks for changes that you're making in your on-premise Active Directory and synchronizes them to your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. Not only this, but this tool will also provide you with different authentication solutions like setting up password hash synchronization, device registration. If you want to set up Active Directory Federation services, you can do all of that. Yeah. And now organizations are responsible for maintaining this directory synchronization solution, as this tool will be either installed on your domain controller or it will be installed on a member server that is part of your domain. Now, one of the alternative of this tool is your Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, which is a cloud-based solution that synchronizes your user, group, and mail contact objects from your on-premise AD to your Azure AD. But in this case, Microsoft will be responsible for maintaining this directory synchronization solution instead of you having to do it as an organization. Yeah. Now, whenever you're selecting a hybrid identity model, one of the prerequisite or one of the very important things that you have to consider is the authentication. Okay. If you are implementing a hybrid identity model, who will be performing authentication for your identities? Yeah. There are two categories of authentication types that you can choose from. First is a managed authentication, and the other one is the federated authentication. Managed authentication is further divided into two more types. First is your password hash synchronization, which is the default one that is suggested by Microsoft, and it's the easiest authentication solution to set up. Yeah. In this kind of authentication solution, not only your usernames will be synchronized to the cloud, but the passwords will be converted into a hash value, and that hash value indeed is then synchronized to the cloud. Yeah. Now, for organizations that do not or are not comfortable with synchronizing passwords in the cloud, right? They want their authentication to be done from their on-premise Active Directory, right? They do not want Azure Active Directory to perform any kind of authentication for their identities. In that case, they can go with the pass-through authentication solution. Yeah. With pass-through authentication, Azure AD has ADDS perform the authentication for it. Yeah. The option is similar to your password hashing, but provides a simple password validation using on-premise software agents. We call these agents as pass-through agents. Yeah. Now, the other category of your authentication solution that your organization can choose for your hybrid identity model is the federated authentication, in which Azure AD will redirect the client computer requesting authentication to another identity provider, or it could be ADFS in this case. So these are the three different kinds of authentication solution that your organizations can choose from when they are implementing a hybrid identity model. Yeah. So let's dig a little deeper into this and understand how each of these authentication solution work. Let's start with the easiest one, which is password hash synchronization. Yeah. Now, to perform a password hash synchronization, all you need to do is install the Azure AD Connect on either your domain controller or your member server. But make sure they're part of the same domain. Yeah. That is the first step that you have to take. Once you install the Azure AD Connect tool, now the next step is to create a connector between your Azure Active Directory and your on-premise Active Directory. And this is done by providing two sets of credentials. First is the global admin account credential for your Azure Active Directory account, and the other one is the credentials for your enterprise admin account. Yeah. This will help you create a connection between your on-premise Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory. Once this connection is established, now you can start to move identities to the cloud. Okay. And there are two kinds of setup that you can go with. First is the express setup, and the other one is the custom setup. Later, we'll talk about when to use express, when to use custom, but you can choose either one of these options to complete your synchronization. Now, in this case, what will happen is all of your identities, let's say we have an identity in the on-premise called as alex@contoso.com. And then Alex has a password as well, maybe something like password@123. Yeah. So now this user account or this identity will now be created in your Azure Active Directory with the same username, and the password will be converted into a hash value using a complex mathematical algorithm. And this hash value is indeed synchronized to your Azure Active Directory, where Azure Active Directory maintains a database for these passwords. Yeah. Now, if a user wants to sign in and use any Azure Active Directory or Microsoft 365 service like Exchange Online, yeah, user will enter his credentials like maybe alex@contoso.com, And now we'll enter the password as well. Now the authentication request will now go to Azure Active Directory, as Azure Active Directory not only has the username, but has the hash value of the password too. So Azure Active Directory will validate whether the credentials that are provided by the user are correct. If it is correct, it will authorize this request and the user will then be able to access Exchange Online service. Yeah. And that's how your password hash synchronization works. Yeah. So organizations synchronize their ADDS user accounts with Microsoft 365 and they manage their users on premise. Yeah. Now they don't have to install any kind of additional infrastructure. They can use tools like Azure AD Connect or Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync to perform this kind of or to set up this kind of authentication solution. Yeah. Now PHS uses or password hash synchronization uses a secure one-way hash synchronization process to protect your user's password. Yeah. And as I said, the password hash is encrypted during their transmission and stored securely in Azure Active Directory. So your passwords are never stored in plain text. Okay. They're never synchronized in plain text. They're always converted into hash value. And the hash value indeed is then stored in the database of your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. So this is the most easiest and the most common solution a lot of organization uses to implement or a lot of organization uses as their authentication solution for their hybrid identity model. Now, the other solution that your organization can go for is when they use pass-through authentication. Now, the prerequisites of setting up a pass-through authentication is very similar to the prerequisites of setting up a password hash synchronization. The first step that you have to take over here is to install the Azure AD Connect tool on your domain controllers or your member servers. But in this case, once you install the tool and create a connector between your on-premise and Azure Active Directory, you have to go with the custom setup if you want to use pass-through authentication. Once you select the custom setup, now what will happen is you have to now install a lightweight agent in your on-premise environment called as the pass-through agent. Yeah. And this agent will achieve a connection with your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. So now, once you've achieved this kind of connection, let's understand how the authentication would work. Okay. Let's say I have a remote user over here named Alex at contoso.com. And Alex also enters his password to sign in to a Microsoft 365 resource, let's say Outlook, yeah, which is basically your Exchange Online service. Now, as we talked about it, Exchange Online or any Microsoft 365 service for that matter is provided through Azure Active Directory services. Yeah. So no matter who's your authentication solution provider, the authentication request will first go to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory will understand that this is a federated domain and Azure Active Directory is not responsible for performing authentication for this domain. So in this case, the Azure Active Directory will put all of these authentication requests on a special service called as the Azure Bus Queue. called as the Azure bus queue. Yeah. So these authentication requests will be placed over here. And now it would be job of your pass-through agent that we had installed earlier to pull these authentication requests to your on-premise, decrypt them, and validate them against your on-premise Active Directory. If the validation is successful, the response is relayed back to Azure Active Directory, and then Azure Active Directory will be authorizing the access to the resource that your user was looking to access. Yeah. So one thing that you might have noticed is no matter who's performing authentication in your organization, authorization is always done by your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. So as you saw, pass-through authentication authenticates users by validating their on-premise Active Directory credentials against one or more lightweight software agents, right? Microsoft recommends that you install at least 3 for high availability. Yeah. What is this lightweight software agent? As we talked about it, the name of that agent is pass-through agent. Yeah. Now with PTA, you can synchronize ADDS user accounts with Microsoft 365. You manage your users on-premise. When an organization enables PTA, users are redirected to PTA agent to authenticate their credentials. Instead of Azure Active Directory performing the authentication is now performed by your on-premise Active Directory. Yeah. So in this case, we are only synchronizing usernames to the cloud. Yeah. We are not synchronizing any sorts of passwords, either in plain text or either in hash value. Now, the final kind of authentication solution that Microsoft offers for a hybrid identity model is referred to as federated authentication. Yeah. Now, in this case, Azure AD hands off the authentication process to a separate trusted authentication system, such as your Active Directory Federation services, or it could be a third-party identity provider to validate your user's sign-in. Yeah. So you can see over here, there is a lot of IT infrastructure that is required to set up this kind of authentication solution. Yeah. First of all, you need a farm of ADFS servers, which should be at least more than 2. Now you cannot expose the ADFS server directly to the internet. So you need a mediator in between it. So in that case, you need to have at least 2 web application proxy servers, which are then connected to your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. Now, and all of these communication channels have to be secured with the help of certificates. Yeah. So now in this, basically what will happen is if a user tries to log in to any Microsoft 365 service, the authentication request will go to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory will check whether they are responsible for performing authentication for that domain. Once they understand they are not responsible for performing authentication, they will relay this request back to your web application proxy servers. Now, the web application proxy servers will relay this request back to your ADFS server, which will validate against your on-premise Active Directory to see whether the credentials that are provided by the users are correct. If the answer is yes, now this information will be relayed back to Azure Active Directory, who will finally authorize the user's sign-in request. Now, as you can see, this is a very complex solution. It is not only complex, but it's very costly and it's hard to maintain. So that's why federated authentication is primarily for large enterprise organization with more complex authentication requirements. Yeah. It synchronizes your ADDS identities with Microsoft 365, right? It also requires the same concept, like the source authority for that identity will be on-premise ADDS. Yeah. And with the help of federated authentication, the passwords never leave your on-premise environment. Okay, because they don't have to sign in again to use Microsoft 365. Yeah. Now, as we saw, you can either use ADFS as your authentication solution provider, or you can use a third-party identity provider to authenticate their Microsoft 365 service. So depending upon what your business requirements is, you can use any of these authentication solution as a uh, authentication provider or a solution for your hybrid identity model. Right. So yeah, as we talked about it, directory synchronization is nothing but synchronization of directory identities or objects between two different directories. Right. So over here we have your on-premise Active Directory, and over here we have your Azure Active Directory. Then we talked about this, that we install a tool called as the Azure AD Connect between over here that will help us to achieve this synchronization. And some of the advantages of this directory synchronization, that you have a hybrid identity model where the source authority for these identities would be on-premise ADDS, but some of the management can also be done from your Azure Active Directory. You can use services like single sign-on, right, which will allow your users to sign into your applications and resources in a smoother manner. You can use services like multi-factor authentication. This is also referred to as two-factor authentication. You can use conditional access, and you'll have a common identity to access all of your resources. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by common identity? It's easy to understand. Let's say I have some on-premise applications or resources, right? Maybe my HRMS tool, my employee self-service tool. Then I have some cloud application, such as Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and so on. Yeah. Now, if I achieve a directory synchronization, right, with the help of Azure AD Connect tool, right, my identities will be synchronized across both the platform. So if I have a user over here, maybe Alex, this user might be using the credential alex@contoso.com to sign in to their on-premise resources. Yeah. And maybe the password is password@123. Now, Alex has to use the same set of credentials to access their on-premise resources, and Alex will be using the same sets of credential to access their online or cloud resources. Yeah. And it also becomes easier for you as an administrator to manage these identities, as both of these identities are synchronized on both the platforms. Right. So now that we have understood how identity synchronization works and what are the different configuration that you have to do, let's understand how an organization prepares for identity synchronization. Yeah. Now, for an organization that wants to have this hybrid identity model, they must first ensure that their Azure Active Directory deployment is properly configured. Yeah. That means building a foundation of security. That means if you have you want to make sure that all of your admin accounts have multi-factor authentication enabled on them. If you want to add like an extra layer of security, you can do it with the help of conditional access policies, right? In phase two, you can start importing users to Azure Active Directory and enable synchronization and start the management of devices as well. Phase three is where you hand over or start managing your cloud applications with the help of Defender for Cloud Apps. And in phase four is where you start using some of the identity governance solutions that Microsoft is offering, such as using privileged identity models, using access reviews, entitlement management, and so on. Now, before synchronizing your on-premise Active Directory objects to Azure Active Directory, you must prepare your environment by analyzing all of the following topics over here. Now, first is your Active Directory preparation, identifying the source of authority, right? So over here, we use a source anchor attribute called as the GUID value. Yeah. But if you want to use a different value, you can use that, but make sure that it's a unique value. Yeah. Making sure you clean up your on-premise Active Directory. What do you mean by cleaning up on-premise Active Directory? That means if you have any corrupted objects or corrupted database or anything like that, make sure that you initiate a recovery for these objects and database. Otherwise, these corrupted objects may not be synchronized to the cloud, or if you have a corrupted database altogether, the synchronization will fail altogether. Yeah. Fixing issues with your UPN suffixes. This is a very common issue a lot of organization faces when they are performing identity synchronization. Right? Because in your on-premise ADDS, we can have usernames, something like Alex at contoso.local. Right? Now, obviously, contoso.local is a non-routable domain, and this cannot be added in Microsoft 365. Right? So when you synchronize this identity to your Azure Active Directory, since Azure Active Directory cannot recognize this non-routable domain, it will create a different username, which is Alex at whatever the company name is, dot on Microsoft.com. So it will use the default domain name over here. Okay. So you have to make sure that you fix all of these issues with UPN suffixes. If you have any custom domain integrated with your on-premise Active Directory, like contoso.com, make sure that you add this custom domain in your Azure Active Directory as well, so that the common usernames will be used or SMTP addresses will be used when you create emails and usernames across both the platforms. Right. The primary SMTP email address of each user should be used as their UPN as well. That is one of the prerequisite or one of the things that you have to take care when you're once you're starting the identity synchronization. Yeah. Now, in an on-premise environment, we can have like thousands of objects, right? With this kind of UPN related issues. And it's very hard for us as an administrator to log in or manage each and every object and fix this UPN issue with it. Yeah. So in that case, you can use the Microsoft 365 ID Fix tool, which queries all of the objects in your organization, right? That may have some UPN related issues, right? Like incorrect UPN or duplicate attributes. It can help you identify all of these issues with your user objects, and it will display all of these issues in a nice tabular format. Now, all you have to do as an administrator is to identify each and every issue and deploy a fix for it directly from the tool itself, so that you don't have to navigate to each and every object and fix that identity or the object. Now, yeah, as we talked about it, before you start the identity synchronization, you have to choose which tool that you want to work with. Yeah. There are two options to choose from. First is the Azure AD Connect Sync. Yeah. As we talked about it, the provision and configuration is stored and runs on your on-premise sync server. Yeah. And yeah, it is based on an older technology with a large on-premise footprint. Now, there's a new tool that is introduced, which is the Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. Yeah. The provision configuration is stored, configured, and runs in cloud as part of your Azure AD provision service. Yeah. It uses a lightweight agent design that requires a minimal on-premise footprint, but it does not support your Exchange hybrid deployments. Yeah. If you want to set up an Exchange hybrid deployment with your Exchange 2010, 13, 16, or 19 server, in that case, one of the prerequisites is to have directory synchronization. So that directory synchronization can only be achieved using Azure AD Connect Sync tool. You cannot use Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. Now, there are several questions that you have to collect. There are certain questions that you have to answer as an organization before you can start the directory synchronization process. The first one is, on what server do you want to install Azure AD Connect? Yeah. Now, Microsoft recommends that you do it on a dedicated member server, right? But if you want, as an organization, you can install this on a domain controller as well. Do you want to have an Azure AD Connect failover scenario? Okay. So this is the example of the Azure AD Connect failover scenario, right? Where you can use or install the Azure AD Connect tool on a server, which will be your primary tool. Yeah. This tool will be responsible for synchronizing objects from your on-premise Active Directory to your Azure Active Directory. So any changes that you're making over here will be reflected in your Azure Active Directory. But let's say this particular server goes down for any particular reason. Okay. Maybe it's a maintenance issue. Maybe it's a service degradation. Maybe it's like you want to run a security patch or an update on it, right? There could be, many reasons for which this server can go down. Right? So in that case, you can install an alternate Azure AD Connect tool on a different server, and this will be configured in a staging mode. Yeah. That means it will import all of the changes that are happening in your on-premise Active Directory, but it won't export these changes to your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. So when your primary tool goes down, you can enable or disable the staging mode on the backup server, and this will take over the communication and make sure whatever changes that you're making in your on-premise are synchronized to the cloud. Yeah. So as you can see, Azure AD Connect staging server is an inactive server that takes over the synchronization whenever the primary server fails. After that, you have to answer, do you want to synchronize one or more on-premise Active Directories, right? So if you want to have like a multi-forest deployment or a single forest deployment. Do you want to synchronize all or just part of your Active Directory, right? Maybe in your Active Directory, let's say you have a domain called as contoso.com. Within this, maybe you have, sorry, within this, maybe you have, three different OUs, maybe IT, HR, and sales. Now, out of this, you want to just sync the objects that are part of HR and sales OU, and you do not want to sync any objects that are part of the IT OU. Yeah. This feature is called as OU filtering. Yeah. And that is part of your custom setup that you do when you set up your Azure AD Connect. Yeah. Similarly, there are other kinds of filtering that can be provided as well, such as attribute level filtering, right? Domain level filtering, and so on. If you want to use any of the advanced configuration features like write back capabilities, right? Filtering capabilities, single sign-on services, and so on, you have to go with the custom Azure AD Connect setup instead of the express Azure AD Connect setup. Yeah. Right. So yeah, this is again just a reiteration of the things that we saw in the previous slide, right? You can have a multi-forest setup. Like if you have a single forest, single Azure AD tenant, that's not an issue, right? That is by default supported. But for a multi-forest setup, you have to create a trust between those forests and then synchronize that particular forest to your Azure Active Directory. Yeah. Existing forest with your Azure AD Connect, new forest with your cloud provisioning, that can be done as well. Okay. If you want to use the Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync services. Now, when you're initiating the synchronization, organizations should keep the following information in mind when considering these topologies. Yeah. That users and groups that you're planning to sync must be uniquely identified across all the forests. Yeah. Matching across forests does not occur with the Azure AD Cloud Sync. Yeah. So user or group must be represented only once in across all the forests. Okay, so there should not be any duplicate identities or duplicate attributes. Now the source anchor for the object is chosen automatically and it uses the MSDS consistency grid if present. Otherwise, it is going to be using the object grid as you see over here. Now you can't change the attribute that's used for the source anchor, right? Otherwise, it will break the sync between uh, the identities across both the platforms. Now that we have seen how, what are the directory synchronization options that we have and how we can prepare our organizations with, prepare our organization for directory synchronization. Let's understand what are the directory synchronization implementation tools that are available. Right. So for you to install the Azure AD Connect on any machine, right, there are certain prerequisites that have to be met. That means it must be installed on a domain joined server running Windows Server 2016 or later. And the server must be using Windows Server Standard Edition or better. The Azure AD Connect server must have a full GUI installed. Yeah. So installing Azure AD Connect on a Windows Server core isn't supported. The minimum .NET framework version required is 4.6.2. Newer versions of .NET are also supported by this. Now, if you're going with the federated authentication solution, the server where ADFS or web application proxy are installed must be Windows Server 2012 R2 or later. Windows remote management must be enabled on these servers for remote installation. And you also have to configure TLS and SSL certificates and name resolutions. Now, if you're trying to break and analyze traffic between your Azure AD Connect and Azure AD, this is by default not supported, and this will also disrupt the service, which will also affect the synchronization between your on-premise Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory. Right. Now, as I said, you have two options when you're configuring the Azure AD Connect tool. Either you go with the Express setup or you go with the custom setup. Now, Express setup is helpful when you are synchronizing or you have a single Active Directory forest. And the authentication solution that your organization is going to use for your hybrid identity model is your password hash synchronization. And if you have less than 100,000 objects that you're planning to sync to the cloud. Yeah. Because with your Express setup, Microsoft also installs an instance of an SQL server, or I should call as the Express instance of the SQL server. Yeah. Which has a database limit of 10 GB, which is roughly 100,000 objects. Now, if your organization has these requirements, you can definitely go with the Express setup, which can be used to synchronize your identities. But if your organization have multiple forests, they want to use an alternate authentication solution like ADFS or pass-through authentication, or they want to use some of the custom synchronization features like domain filtering, OU filtering, right? Or object filtering. I'm sorry, not object, but rephrase that. Attribute filtering. Right? In that case, they have to go with the custom features or the custom setup. Same thing goes if you want to use some write back capabilities. Now, ideally, when you're synchronizing your identities, right? So ideally, when you're synchronizing your identities from your on-premise Active Directory to your Azure Active Directory, yeah, this is a one-way sync. Sorry about that. Yeah. So as I was saying, whenever you're synchronizing your identities from your on-premise Active Directory to your Azure Active Directory, this is a one-way sync. Yeah. That means whatever attributes or whatever objects that you have in your on-premise will be synchronized to your Azure Active Directory. Similarly, whatever changes that you're making from your on-premise Active Directory, this will be synchronized to your Azure Active Directory. Okay. So the sync goes this way. But with the help of some of the write back features, you can choose to sync some of the identities or some of the attributes back to your on-premise Active Directory. Yeah. What are these write back features? We have three kinds of write back features that are supported as of now. We have the password write back. This will allow your users to reset passwords in the cloud. We have the device write back capability, right? That will allow you to uh, uh, sync devices in your on-premise, the ones that are connected to your Azure Active Directory. And then we have the group write back feature that will allow you to synchronize groups that are created in your Azure Active Directory. So if you want to use some of these customized synchronization features, you have to go with the custom setup. Now, to manage your synchronization services, there are a lot of management tools that are available. One of the tool is your Azure AD Connect Help. Yeah. Now, Azure AD Connect Help helps organization monitor their on-premise identity infrastructure and the synchronization services that are available through Azure AD Connect. Yeah. So it will enable your organization to view alerts and email notification. It will help you to see the performance, right, of the Azure AD Connect services, whether they are able to synchronize all the identities to the cloud or whether they have run into any kind of issues. This can be easily identified. You'll be also able to see usage analytics as well, right? And the settings that were configured as part of your synchronization service. Yeah. So whenever you install the Azure AD Connect service or Azure AD Connect application on your servers, there is an agent, which is the Azure Connect Health agent that gets automatically installed as part of that particular application, okay, which is constantly running in the backend to identify different issues and the performance of the Azure AD Connect 2. Okay. And this information is then synchronized to your Azure Active Directory, from where you can analyze the performance of your Azure AD Connect 2. Now, if you want to use the Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, there are certain prerequisites that you have to meet. First is you have to create the Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync GMSA, which is a group managed service account to run the agent service. Yeah. After that, you have to create a hybrid identity administrator account for your Azure AD tenant, and you have to make sure that that account is not a guest user. Yeah. Now, as I said, we don't have to actually install the Azure AD Connect tool, but we still have to install a provisioning agent. Okay. But that has to be installed on Windows Server 2016 or later in your on-premise server. Yeah. Now, to maintain high availability, you can use the Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync to operate continuously without failure for a long time. Yeah. Now, if you have any firewalls or proxy servers that might be blocking the communication from the servers that are installed in on-premise to the Azure Active Directory tenant, you have to make sure that you make those exceptions uh, in your firewalls and proxy servers so that it does not block any kind of communication from the servers that are on-premise to communicate with your Azure AD data centers or Azure data centers. Now to configure your Azure AD Cloud Sync, first you have to install the Azure AD Connect provisioning agent, which I said has to be installed on Windows Server 2016 or a later version. Verify that the agent is installed and it is running. Once you do that, you can configure the Azure AD Cloud Sync provisioning with the configuration or with whatever custom configuration that you might have.